We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up to claim it. President Ibrahim Traore. In the sands of Tilia, under the early sun of West Africa, something remarkable unfolded, and the world nearly missed it. It was not a grand summit, not a headline event, not a speech before the United Nations. It was a formation of soldiers. But behind the columns of armored trucks and the precision drills, there was something far greater. The quiet beginnings of a new doctrine, one that says Africa has the right to protect itself by itself. The Alliance of Sahel states Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, once called vulnerable, now stand together not to challenge the world, but to reclaim their corner of it. At first glance, it looked like a military exercise. But look closer, and you'll see something deeper. A new kind of unity, a new kind of leadership, a new kind of hope. And now the question is no longer whether Africa can build its own security. The question is, what happens when it does? If you still believe in dignity, not just for one nation, but for all, stay with us, because what you're about to hear won't be on the evening news. The Sahel region has often been described in policy briefings as fragile, volatile, or unstable. But what rarely gets said, at least not in public, is that it was made that way. For decades, security in West Africa was outsourced. Foreign troops arrived with manuals written oceans away. Conferences were held in capital cities, while the countryside slipped into silence. Governments were told to wait for funding for equipment for permission. In that wait, villages burned, schools closed, markets disappeared. By 2023, over 3 million people had been displaced by violence across the Sahel. In Burkina Faso alone, nearly 1 in 10 citizens had been forced from their homes. And still promises of help came late or never. Meanwhile, military alliances like AES, once seen as guardians of regional stability, found themselves paralyzed. Bureaucratic delays and foreign dependencies often meant that by the time decisions were made in boardrooms, communities had already fallen. That's the backdrop to what happened in Tilia. The joint exercise, codenamed Tarhan Nakal 2025, meaning love of country, was not just a training mission. It was a statement. 5,000 troops from Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Togo gathered not just to simulate defense, but to demonstrate autonomy. And for the first time, the funding came not from foreign donors, but from within. National defense budgets were pooled. Barracks were built. Command centers were outfitted in local languages, not colonial tongues. A desert airstrip was extended by 500 meters to land heavy cargo planes, because this time, Africa wasn't asking to borrow. It was building. Burkina Faso's presence under President Ibrahim Traore was especially symbolic. Once seen as a country overwhelmed by insurgency, it now brought forward over 1,000 trained commandos, not just to fight, but to protect communities and rebuild trust. And perhaps most striking of all, Togo joined, a coastal democracy, not a military-led government. Its participation changed everything, because now, this wasn't just a block of transitional regimes. It was a regional shield drawing strength, not from shared politics, but from shared danger. In that dusty gathering, a quiet truth emerged for the first time in a long time. West Africa wasn't waiting. It was moving. It began with boots on the ground. But what shook the old order wasn't the boots. It was the flag they marched under. For years, the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, was treated in diplomatic circles as a temporary response, a military stopgap between crises. Critics called it a club of coups. News headlines questioned its legitimacy. But that narrative collapsed when Togo arrived. Togo didn't send a letter. It didn't hold a press conference. It deployed 600 elite soldiers directly into Niger to join the Tarhan Nakal exercise. That move, quiet, confident, and coordinated, changed everything. Here was a coastal nation, democratic and constitutionally stable, choosing to stand beside landlocked neighbors often described as fragile. No longer could AES be brushed aside as a transitional alliance. Togo's participation redefined it. It became a shield not just for Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, but for the region. The signal to Paris and Brussels was unmistakable. The old binary of democracy versus military regime no longer explained the ground reality. Countries were not aligning by governance models, but by shared survival. In Washington, where security discussions around Africa often revolve around counterterrorism funding, the silence was even more telling. No official statements, no condemnation, just a quiet shift in posture, a recognition perhaps that a new framework was forming without American permission. This wasn't about ideology, it was about agency. For years, African security forces were trained in US and European academies, drilled on NATO tactics, and evaluated on metrics that looked good on paper, but didn't stop villages from being attacked. Local soldiers were expected to operate with imported doctrines, limited authority, and outdated equipment. The result, a continent that bled slowly, while others held the tourniquet. Tarhan Nakal 2025 flipped that script. The AES troops didn't just march in formation, they operated across language barriers, desert terrain, and asymmetric threats using regional intelligence and field-tested tactics. Their operations were based not on the abstraction of maps, but on lived knowledge, motorbike raids, cattle theft patterns, border fluidity. They trained together, yes, but more importantly, they listened together to local chiefs, to market vendors, to villagers who knew the patterns of silence that precede violence. Burkina Faso's commandos brought more than weapons. They brought experience from conflict zones along the Mali border, where over 400 villages had faced attacks since 2021. These soldiers had seen firsthand what worked and what didn't. And now, they weren't isolated. They were part of something collective. Still, there was no pageantry, no foreign press junkets, no carefully curated photo ops, because this was not a performance. This was a trial run for something larger. What happens when a continent stops outsourcing its own protection? And here's what made it profound. This wasn't just military coordination, it was emotional solidarity. Troops were told plainly this wasn't a war of policy, it was a war of memory. Every soldier had lost a cousin, a school, a hometown. This was personal. No contracts, no career incentives, just defense of home. Even the name of the exercise, Tarhan Nakal, carried weight. Love of country. Not in the abstract, in the lived, local, soil-stained way. The moment Togo joined, the ripple effect began. Eyes turned from the battlefield to the map. What would Ghana do? Could Ivory Coast follow? Would Senegal reassess its alliances? Because when a democracy like Togo chooses to move with AES, it sends a message louder than sanctions or speeches. We're not choosing regimes. We're choosing our right to respond. And the implications are far-reaching. It means West Africa no longer accepts the notion that defense must follow the rules written elsewhere. It means borders are no longer limitations, but launch points. And most of all, it means that sovereignty is not a slogan. It's a strategy. But make no mistake, this is not the end of the story. It's the start of a real test. The strength of AES will not be proven in military drills. It will be proven in whether this alliance can earn the trust of the people it claims to protect. And that trust isn't given because of uniforms or unity. It's given when people believe they are seen. The true question now is not whether AES can fight. It's whether it can lead not just troops, but communities. Because once the drills are over, what remains is the memory of silence, or the beginning of something new. The first thing they did wasn't to dig trenches or erect watchtowers. They reopened a clinic. In the Gao region of Mali, where health posts had stood abandoned for years, a unit of AES soldiers arrived, not with rifles raised, but with medical crates. They brought bandages, vaccines, even soap. And for the first time in a long time, mothers lined up to have their children treated not by foreign aid workers, but by their own countrymen. This wasn't a fluke. It was policy, across Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. A quiet shift had begun, one that few analysts expected, and even fewer media outlets covered. These were soldiers, yes, but they were also something else. Repairers of broken trust. It was called civil-military fusion. The idea was simple, but revolutionary security cannot come at the cost of dignity. So AES deployed teams tasked not with patrolling, but with listening and then rebuilding. In Niger's northern markets, Army engineers rebuilt stall zones so that over 2,000 merchants could return to trade. In Burkina Faso's Yatenga province, convoys escorted displaced families back home before the rainy season, ensuring that crops could be planted again. In parts of Mali, soldiers helped fix the very roads they once marched on so children could walk to school again. These weren't headlines. They were lifelines. And they came with a powerful message. This army belongs to the people, not to any foreign patron. President Ibrahim Traore made that message clear. In his speeches, he urged his commanders to wear their national flags proudly during relief missions. "We are your army, not guests," he said. And in village after village, that phrase began to echo, not as a slogan, but as reassurance. Because for too long, the only time soldiers were seen was during raids or arrests. Now they were bringing medicine books, even solar panels. It wasn't perfect. Mistakes were made. Missteps happened. But something had changed. The presence of the state was no longer limited to distant capitals. It was now visible and tangible in communities that had once felt forgotten. This civil approach also created unexpected ripple effects. Local chiefs, once distrustful of central governments, began volunteering intelligence on insurgent movements. Religious leaders who had previously criticized state corruption were now hosting peace dialogues in mosques with AES officers present. Even displaced youth, many at risk of radicalization, began to enroll in community security workshops hosted by returning soldiers. What was happening wasn't just counterinsurgency, it was political repair. And the symbolism didn't stop at service delivery. Community radio stations, long defunct, were brought back to life. In Pular Zarma and dozens of dialects, broadcasts resumed, not from foreign NGOs, but from local journalists. News updates weren't just about troop movements. They included weather forecasts, school reopenings, and wedding announcements. Life was returning not from the outside, but from within. Still, this wasn't about replacing civilian governance with military rule. In fact, the leadership of AES knew that winning territory was one thing, but winning trust, that was the true battlefield. So they introduced something rare in West African military history: accountability from the ground up. Field commanders were now required to submit conduct reports not just on enemy engagement, but on how their troops interacted with civilians, how disputes were resolved, how complaints were handled, what promises were made and kept. In high-risk zones, retired teachers and village elders were embedded with patrol units, not as combatants, but as witnesses. Their task, to ensure that soldiers remained protectors, not predators. Because as every leader in AES understood, even one act of misconduct could unravel months of trust building. And perhaps that's the most important truth of all. This was not a public relations campaign. This was a survival strategy. The IMF didn't fund it. The World Bank didn't design it. It came from national budgets tight as they were, and from communities that had nothing left to lose. In Washington and Brussels, the shift went largely unnoticed at first. Analysts focused on troop movements and geopolitical alignments, but on the ground in the markets and mosques, in clinics and courtyards, the real transformation was unfolding. For the first time in decades, African security was not defined by what it lacked, but by what it built. And it built something that money can't buy: trust. The drills have ended, the cameras are gone, and the sound of armored convoys fades into the desert wind. But the real test for the alliance of Sahel states, for Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and now Togo, begins not in battlefields, but in villages, where the only thing more fragile than safety is trust. What happens when the uniforms stay? For years, soldiers in this region were symbols of fear, not reassurance. Their arrival often meant curfews, confiscations, or worse. In some areas, troops were seen as distant agents of foreign-trained elites, not as defenders of the people. AES leaders knew this legacy, and that's why the most radical change they introduced wasn't tactical, it was cultural. They called it accountability from below. Instead of letting discipline flow only from generals, AES flipped the model village elders, retired school teachers, and respected community leaders were brought in to observe troop behavior and file conduct reports. These civilian monitors didn't carry guns. They carried notebooks. Every dispute resolved, every complaint logged, every promise recorded. It was a quiet revolution not against the West, but against the cynicism that had long infected African governance. Because here's the hard truth. It's not enough to free a village if the people still feel captive. But even revolutionary ideas face limits. In remote areas of Niger and northern Burkina Faso, reports still emerge of overreached soldiers acting without oversight, displaced communities still awaiting food or clearance to return. Not all stories are hopeful. Not all mistakes are small. And so the question becomes sharper. Who holds the line when the lines blur between protector and authority? Civil-military fusion can rebuild clinics. It can reopen markets. But can it guarantee justice when soldiers misstep? AES has taken a bold approach. But boldness alone isn't a safeguard. That's why a second layer of transformation is underway, strengthening community legal networks. In several pilot zones, AES has started working with local mediators and women's cooperatives, not just to deliver aid, but to establish reporting channels outside the military chain of command. In Burkina Faso's north-central region, for instance, a group of women traders now hold monthly forums with military liaisons to review behavior-raised concerns and propose joint safety protocols. These are not symbolic gestures. They are checks on power. Because real sovereignty, the kind that lasts, doesn't just defend against outside threats. It guards against internal decay. And this is where the Western audience must pause. Many Americans remember when ideals like nation building were projected onto foreign lands. When phrases like winning hearts and minds were written into strategy papers, only to dissolve in the face of local realities. What the AES is attempting now isn't a replica of those efforts. It's something more intimate, more difficult. It's about building a relationship between soldiers and citizens, not through speeches, but through actions repeated over time in places where there are no journalists and no applause. Because rebuilding trust after decades of fear isn't about a single drill. It's about what happens when no one is watching. And that's what makes this moment so fragile. If the AES succeeds, it will have done what no external force has achieved in the Sahel: fuse protection with participation and force with humility. But if it fails, if misconduct goes unchecked, if discipline slips, if communities feel silenced again, then the hope now rising in dusty courtyards and newly opened clinics could vanish, and with it, a rare chance at genuine self-determination. The stakes are that high. So yes, the armored vehicles have rolled out of Tilia, but the real weight of this alliance is being carried on quieter roads, the kind that lead to a mother's doorway, or a reopened school, or a farmer's field once feared to be mined. And on those roads, the question still echoes. Can this alliance not only stand, but stand accountable? For over a century, Africa's borders were drawn by outsiders. So were its treaties, its trade terms, and too often, its security doctrines. But today, from the Sahel to the Atlantic coast, that map is being redrawn, not with ink or edicts, but with footsteps in the sand. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, is not just forming battalions. It is forming a new interpretation of sovereignty, one that ignores colonial-era boundaries and instead focuses on threat patterns, shared terrain, and the real-time needs of communities. What does that mean in practice? It means AES troops are now trained to cross borders in pursuit of insurgents without waiting for international clearance. It means intelligence is shared not based on diplomatic rankings, but on mutual urgency. And it means decisions about security are made in Niamey and Ouagadougou, not in Paris or Washington. This isn't just a tactical shift. It's philosophical. For decades, sovereignty in Africa was defined negatively by what a nation could keep out. Today, AES is attempting to define it positively by what a region can build together. The creation of a 5,000-strong permanent force, fully integrated, jointly commanded, and independently funded, is no longer a proposal. It is a standing reality. With infantry battalions, drone units, and mobile response teams, the AES force represents the most coherent military integration in West African history. And yet perhaps its boldest doctrine is not its muscle but its mindset. AES does not wait. Unlike the traditional ECOWAS model, where interventions often lag behind bureaucratic approval and donor support, the alliance is structured for preemption. When intelligence flags an emerging threat, AES units move quickly, across terrain, across borders. This speed is not recklessness, it's a survival necessity. In the Sahel, threats mutate fast. What begins as cattle theft becomes insurgency. What starts as rumor becomes a raid. Delay is defeat. Western observers have noticed. Some applaud the local ownership. Others worry about mission creep or lack of oversight. But beneath the policy language is a deeper discomfort. AES does not ask for permission to act, and that challenges decades of foreign-managed security frameworks. And while the U.S. hesitates, other powers are already stepping into the vacuum. Russian advisors, hardened by years of warfare in Syria and Ukraine, have quietly entered training rotations. Drone warfare, psychological operations, even cyber defense, these are no longer exclusive to NATO. Moscow offers them without long lectures or conditions tied to aid. Still, AES leaders have made one point clear: they are not searching for a new master. They are playing chess, not checkers. Strategic partnerships, yes, but sovereignty first. To that end, AES is cautious. Russian assistance is transactional weapons for respect, but there is no signing away of airbases, no extraction deals that last decades, no political strings that override local authority. Compare that with the past. For years, African soldiers were trained abroad, armed abroad, and briefed in languages not their own. Their missions were often tied to counterterrorism agendas that prioritized external threats over local fears. The result, a region with foreign-equipped militaries and underprotected markets. Now that equation is changing. And it's not just the Sahel. Togo's participation cracked open the framework. If a stable democracy can join the alliance, then what stops Ghana or Côte d'Ivoire from rethinking their security posture? If borders are no longer barriers to cooperation, what new regional map will emerge? This is why Tarhan Nakal 2025 matters. Not because of the number of troops, not because of the aerial maneuvers or new barracks, but because of what it symbolizes: a break from dependency. And that symbolism has power. It forces a new conversation in Washington. Not about aid, but about respect. Not about helping Africa, but about whether America is ready to listen to a continent that has decided to speak for itself. That is not anti-American. It is anti-arrogance. And to older Americans, those who watched Vietnam unfold on black and white TVs, who remember Watergate and COINTELPRO, this moment may feel familiar. Because at its core, it's about something you've seen before: a people tired of being managed, choosing instead to be heard. So the question is no longer, can the West trust AES? The question is, can it respect them? They said the Sahel was a graveyard of foreign promises, but now something else is being planted in that dust belief. Not in outsiders, but in each other. In clinics where mothers once feared to walk, there are lines again. In markets that once fell silent, voices rise in bargaining. In homes, long-abandoned fires are burning again, not in fear, but for cooking. This is not the work of foreign missions. This is the labor of African resolve. And standing at the center of it all is a generation that refuses to be defined by what the world expects. President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso speaks not like a man looking to lead forever, but like someone holding the mic for a continent ready to speak. We did not ask for permission to be free, he says. We stood up to claim it. To our brothers and sisters watching from afar, from Detroit to Dakar, from Atlanta to Accra, this moment is not just about security. It's about dignity. To the generation who once marched across Selma, who watched Vietnam through flickering televisions, who questioned empires in all their forms, we ask you, can you see yourselves in this story? Because we are not asking for pity. We are asking for memory. If you ever believed in justice, then now is the time to remember why. Share this story. Subscribe. Stand with us. Because Africa has risen. And this time we will not bow.